Hey folks, this is George and Bryce, and our project is supervised machine learning of nanoporous material characteristics.
So we figured we would start with just a general introduction to what nanoporous materials are. So as you might guess from the name, they are materials with very small pores on the scale of 1 to 100 nanometers, which means they can be efficiently filled with fluid or gas. They're very light and highly ordered, and importantly, they have tunable physical and chemical properties. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about a type of nanoporous materials known as covalent organic frameworks. So these consist of covalent bonds linking subunits, which are built out of light elements using reticular synthesis. And one of the noteworthy uses that we're going to be discussing today is absorption and delivery of methane gas.
All right, and the second part of the introduction, we need to introduce Gaussian process regression. So that is the machine learning algorithm that we decided to investigate for this project. So Gaussian process regression relies on Bayes' theorem over here on the right in the colors. One important thing of note is that prior knowledge is equivalent to whatever the current model thinks, as it were. So as the model is exposed to more data and learns more data, the current conception it has of the data set that it's learning is being updated. So one of the central features that's in charge of updating the prior knowledge or updating the model is what's called the covariance function or the kernel function, represented by K in the bottom right. This kernel function determines how stringent or lenient the model should be with incorporating new information. So we're going to look at multiple kernels over the course of this study. And one cool thing about GPR is that it's pretty powerful in that it actually calculates a separate distribution of possible functions for each XY pair that it's exposed to versus just a distribution of possible Ys for each X. So it's actually computing a lot more information. And because of that, there's a potential for GPR-based models to become more accurately fit to a given data set than just normal linear regression.
Okay, so just a setup for our process for this project. So we are using machine learning models to predict the COF methane delivery ability after learning only features that describe their chemical and physical composition. So one of the things we're going to do is compare a random forest regression like we learned in class to our GPR model and compare their performances. And then we're going to look at specifically for the GPR model, what kind of kernels we can use and how they perform. We're also going to look at different feature set sizes and how many features you really need. And we're going to look at different training and test set sizes as well.
All right, and just real quickly, here's our data set. So it's about 70,000 hypothetical or in silico / simulated COFs generated by a research group in 2018. There are about 53 features to begin with. We narrowed it down to 12 based on the research of Deshwal et al. In 2021. And those were handpicked features to help push machine learning models to learn the structure-function relationship specifically. One important thing about this data that we had to do to begin with is because it's a Gaussian process, we had to standardize the data to become Gaussian for the features and the labels. So that means we converted it to have a mean of 0 and unit variance.
Okay, and some of the analytical tools that we employ in this project are looking at the fit score versus the training set size. And we do this in a couple different ways. First, comparing the two different regressors, and then comparing the two different kernels for a Gaussian process regressor. And then we also do a similar plot for using all of the features versus the top 3 as judged by our feature importance plot. The second type of plot that we're going to show is a parity plot, which sort of measures the fit of a regression line, essentially how well your data predicts the actual values. And then we're going to look at the permutation feature importance, which shows the most important features in terms of predicting the methane delivery ability. And finally, we're going to look at the calibration honesty plot, which compares the residual prediction errors to the standard deviation of the test set data.
All right, and just diving right in. So our first comparison is between regressor types, and then within regressor types, kernel type. So we're plotting a random forest versus a GPR with RBF kernel and GPR with the Mattern kernel. Something that may not be immediately obvious unless you get pretty close to it is that the GPR with the Mattern kernel model is actually performing better than the random forest at training set sizes below about 100. So that's one of the advantages known in the literature about GP, is that it is useful for learning smaller training set sizes because of the amount of information that it's computing when it fits. It is learning more and doing more with less. We also see that Mattern does better than RBF overall, and this is potentially unsurprising given that Mattern is a generalization of RBF with an additional parameter that controls smoothness. So in this case, smoothness of fit helped in its overall fit versus the RBF kernel. And we can also see that as initial training set size increases, the actual score, the computed scores get better for all.
Okay, and so now we have just selected the Gaussian process regressor, specifically with the Mattern kernel that we talked about in the last slide, and we're looking at the deliverable capacity for methane with different training set sizes. So as you might expect, the R squared value of the GPR increases substantially as you go from a training set size of say 7 to 700. However, most of the gains seem to occur between training set sizes of about 50 to 250. Farther improvements are pretty marginal after you hit about 200 to 250.
All right, moving on to feature importance using our GPR model. Is just a measure of how influential a given learned feature was in the prediction of methane delivery ability by the model. And so you can see that our top 3 as measured here are density, void fraction, and largest included sphere diameter.
Okay, next we're looking at the honesty or calibration plot of a GPR with an initial training set size of 250. And so as you would expect, as the standard deviation increases, the range of those variance values also increases. One of the other things that we looked at is just how many of these dots fall below the 0 line. And what that means is that their variance is negative, which means that the test value is less than the prediction value. So we found that about 53% of the data was over predicted, which gives us the indication that the GPR it has a slight bias towards over predicting the values.
And then moving on to a comparison of the feature set size that we allowed our models to train on. So again, this is GPR model with the Mattern kernel. The blue values come from models that were trained with all features, so all 12. And then the yellow-orange values come from models that were trained using only the top 3 features, as described by the permutation importance plot beforehand. So you can see that at small training set sizes, they perform relatively similarly, and they both perform well. That starts to drop off a little bit as initial training set size gets above 250 for the top 3 features model. And then it drops off completely after 500 for the top 3 features model. And our working theory for why that's the case is because as we're increasing training set size, because of the 70-30 train test split, we're also commensurately increasing the test set size. And because of that bigger test set size, it's giving the models a higher probability of encountering a more exotic COF that contains information that may not necessarily have been represented well using only those top 3 features from the initial training set.
So finally, here are just some suggestions for things that we could improve going beyond what we did for this project. So one sort of thing we could do is try different kernels for the GPR. We could also look at different training and set sizes, specifically sort of independently delineating what is the effect of changing the training set size versus what is the effect of changing the test set size independently. We can look at different number of training epochs. We can perhaps implement parallel processing if necessary. We can consider different label variables such as the nitrogen delivery capacity. And we could also look at empirical versus in silico COF databases, which we would expect to have fewer training examples than a simulated set, which is where we'd expect the GPR to really shine.
And thank you for your attention.